Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the And God Said podcast. I'm Reverend Kimberly Constant. I am your host for this podcast, which I offer in conjunction with an online Bible study that I offer called Cover to Cover, in which we read and study every single book of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation over roughly a 9-month period. So if you're interested and you want to find out more about the study, I offer reading plans and discussion questions and Zoom discussion groups for those who are interested. You can find out more information on my website, kimberlyconstantministries.com. You're also welcome to just tune in for the podcasts themselves. I'm glad you're here in whatever capacity you find yourself, and I hope you will enjoy this next set of lectures in which we look at two very interesting books in the Bible from the same time period, but couldn't be more different in the outcomes of their stories. And I really like the juxtaposition of these two books. So today we're going to kick things off for the books of Judges and Ruth. And I've entitled this, Things Fall Apart, Setting the Scene for the Books of Judges and Ruth. So if you're in my Bible study and following along with the reading plan, this is something that's going to help situate you before you begin reading so that you can have some things to look for as well as some background information, because there's some things, especially in Ruth, that we kind of need to know to understand what's going on in the story. So let's start with looking at Judges. So first, if we're looking at where we are in the history of Israel as a nation. So we ended the last set of lectures on the book of Joshua, and it's around 1250, debatable. It depends on what scholarly opinion you follow. I tend to go for the 1250 date, and if you want to know more about that, go back to the lectures on Exodus, because I talked about that, the dating in those. So anyway, we're just at the heel of that. So Joshua and the people have infiltrated into the land. They have finally begun the process of settling the land. They divided it up. But what we come to find is that they didn't eradicate all of the Canaanite people. They were supposed to. They didn't do it. And Joshua, if we remember from those lectures, that was conquest literature. And so the whole point of that genre is to just insert some hyperbole. We decimated the Canaanite people. Well, that didn't mean that they killed every single Canaanite. Certainly they did as a whole conquer it, but there were still a lot of battles left to be fought. There were still ites, Canaanites living in the land, and ites of other varieties surrounding the people that are going to cause them problems. So we're going to see them have to deal with that as we look at the book of Judges and Ruth. So this is just after the generation of Joshua passes away. So I don't know, what do you want to think, like 50 years or so maybe, after they finally kind of settled and renewed themselves to the covenant in Canaan. So Judges, let's talk about authorship and dating. This is going to be unexciting because we just don't know much. The author is unknown. It appears to be one main author that's writing the main story, but certainly there are editorial additions, which is basically true of every book in the Bible. I mean, it took multiple people to bring it to shape and to provide us with the form that we have today. It was probably written fairly close to when the events happened, much like Joshua, sometime during the reign of King David. So that would be around 100 BC. So maybe, 50, 100 years later, something like that. The genre, it's historiography, which is history, but not history as we might think of history in the modern day terminology. They aren't always concerned with chronological order in the Bible and in this time period in general. When we write history, often it's, to try to give the best, most accurate description of what has happened in order, starting with someone's birth to their death, for instance. But here, that's not the case. And so they will move things around to kind of fit the theme or what they're trying to convey. Also, there's an issue with the numbers, which if you've been listening to the podcast, you will not be surprised by this. The numbers in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, do not have a one-to-one correlation with numbers as we understand them today. We're not quite sure how to crack the code of numbers. So They don't add up, and that's not surprising. But here, there's also an explanation that makes sense about it because of the way that the judges overlap each other. So if you add up all the numbers and dates and you try to make a chronological timeline of what's happening, the sum of years is about 100 more than what it should be. Why would this be? Well, because there wasn't one judge that ruled over all of Israel. Deborah might be judge over, her tribal area. And then there's a different judge over the northern tribal area, for instance. Deborah and Barak, her right-hand man, her judgeship overlaps with the end of the period of peace after Judge Ehud. So there's overlapping, there's regional leadership going on. And so it's not like one judge has their time and then 40 years of peace and then the next judge. Like picture more bleeding into each other's territories. Different parts of the land would experience peace or conflict at different times. So there's certain tribes that don't seem to have as much conflict, probably because some of it's geography where they are. They're not surrounded by as many enemies. And then some of it is because they didn't eradicate all the Canaanites. And so wherever there were big pockets of people left, they would have had more skirmishes to deal with. So it's multiple things happening at once here in the book of Judges. The structure is pretty straightforward. It's not a terribly long book. So the first 1, 2, 3.5 chapters are a prologue. So it kind of sets the scenes, an overview of what happened after the death of Joshua. It actually even restates the death of Joshua, and then it kind of sets the scene for what's going to follow. So we see restated that things fell apart after Joshua's generation passed away, and kind of why that happened. Then the meat of Judges, the biggest chunk of it is chapter 3, about halfway through verse 7, all the way to chapter 16, deals with this repeated cycle of sin, which I'm going to get into that when we look at Judges itself. But during the reign of the Judges, things go from bad to worse. If we think it's bad at the end of the prologue, it's just going to get worse, and everything comes undone. And there's a cycle that they engage in, sin, and then they cry out to God, and then God raises up a judge to deliver them. The judge does his or her duty, and they experience peace, and then lo and behold, they fall into sin again. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about cycle of sin. Then in chapter 17, that cycle just falls apart, and the people stop even crying out to God. At this point, it is Wild West. Every man or woman for themselves. No one is following the will of God. And so we see the consequences of what happens when this nation abandons their covenant promise. They give into complete depravity, and all sorts of terrible things happen. It's not a cheery book, this, but it is very important for us to study because, boy, sometimes it feels like we're living in very similar times in this day and age. So what themes and theology will you find? What do you want to look for as you're reading? Always God's grace and mercy. I really probably harp on this too much, but I think it's something that people maybe will be surprised to find in the Old Testament. The reason I keep talking about this is because I know I used to feel this way at one time. Oh, the God of the Old Testament is so different from the God of the New Testament, and I'm scared of the God of the Old Testament, and I don't really want anything to do with that God. I'm scared enough on my own. I'm guilty enough. I'm one of those people that feels very strongly bad about right and wrong. I don't need the extra guilt piled onto me. So I always struggled with the Old Testament until I really got to study it and understand what was happening. And when you do that, we find God's grace everywhere. God is God. God is the same God. He was the same God at the creation of the earth as he will be when Jesus comes back and he restores and brings about new creation, and all the way in between. He is the same God. The Old Testament God is the same as the New Testament God. Remember, we're seeing progressive revelation in real time. The people coming to know who he is, to understand him better, to be able to describe God better. And so in the Old Testament, they're lacking some understanding still. They're getting a lot of information, but the full and complete revelation won't come until Jesus. So I like for you to look for it. Look for the grace and mercy. If you look for it, you will find it. God wants to give grace and mercy to people. God wants us to love him in return. God already loves us. There's nothing we have to do to earn it, but God wants us to turn towards him and love him back. That is the heart of God. And it's amazing when you just stop to think about that truth. And it was true in the Old Testament times as well. But here's the thing. In order to receive grace and mercy, you have to turn towards God. You've got to open your hands and receive it. God is right there. He is pursuing. He is ready to give us these things. But we have to turn back to him. And so we will see that developed in this story of Judges and of Ruth. We'll continue to see in these books God use imperfect people as his hands and feet and voices. And there's implications to that. You know, what does it mean that God uses someone imperfect or a talking donkey, for instance, if we think back to some of the story of Balak and Balaam in the Pentateuch? What does it mean that God uses someone that then goes off and sins in a great way? How do we reconcile with that? And what does it mean for us? And how do we apply that to us? So look for that as well. God continuing to use just really imperfect humans. Let's think about the consequences. God allows us to experience consequences. Yes, God steps in. Yes, God wants to offer salvation and grace and mercy. But that doesn't mean that we won't experience consequences and sometimes punishment. So we're going to see Israel continually break their covenant promise over and over again in Judges. And because of that, they're going to continually experience the consequences of doing so. Remember, God has already said, if you do not uphold the covenant, here's what's going to happen. So they know. They have been forewarned. They have had to swear to uphold the covenant themselves. And so they know very well what is going to happen. And guess what? It comes to pass. And of course, we're going to find in these stories how much we need God, how much they needed God back then, how much we still need God today. That when we're left to our own devices, when it becomes the wild, wild west, when it's every person for him or herself and people are just doing whatever they want, it doesn't end well. So far, we've seen that play out a few times in the Bible, and it hasn't ended well. Spoiler alert, it's not going to end well here either. Some background information to help you understand, again, what's going on and the fact that, like I said, there are overlapping skirmishes, there's overlapping judgeships. So Israel at this time doesn't have a super defined national structure that's human-based, I will say. Like there's not a national organizational system. Right now, at this period of time, they are organized according to tribes and clans, and they're kind of self-governing. Each tribe, even each clan, has some autonomy, has the ability to to deal with, lawbreakers, and there's not just like a central unit right now. They're too busy still trying to settle the land for that to have come up. And so they're very loosely related to one another. Some of it's because of geography. There's a vast difference between the tribes of southern Holy Land region and the tribes of the northern region and the tribes that live in the area that we would now call Jerusalem. Some of them have more struggles with the Canaanites than others. Again, it depends on how well they did at eradicating the people in the areas that they settled. Some of them have struggles with neighboring ites, Moabites, the Edomites, all those people. And then there's also internal tensions between the tribes. So sometimes a tribe will get attacked and they'll say, hey, neighboring tribes, show up. Like the tribe of Judah might say, we're being attacked. Hey, Ephraim, Manasseh, like we need you guys, come help us. And they wouldn't always do it. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. So they have their own inward tension. And so this is going to prove to be a disaster, not just physically, not just with physical battles, but with spiritual battles as well. Also remember that during this time, even though there's no human organizational element, there's no king, there's no central government, for instance, they have God. And this is a theocracy. God is their ultimate leader. God is king. God is everything. God is their military decision maker. He has complete control, and he is supposed to be the unifying factor. Their faith is supposed to be their unifying factor. They're supposed to gather together a few times out of the year to celebrate the feasts and festivals and come together as a community, gather at the tabernacle, and remember what God has done for them. That's not happening here. They are forgetting this important fact. And as the story unfolds, we're going to see the covenant community just disintegrate. All of their sacred traditions, all of their rules and laws for staying holy, it's all going to give way to abominations. And the majority of the people are going to start worshiping the pagan gods of their surrounding neighbors. So some things to notice as you look at Judges. What is the nature of the community of faith? What should it look like? Pay attention to the cycle of sin. How long does it take for the people to cry out to God for deliverance? What happens after God raises up a judge and a battle is fought? Who receives rest? The people. What else receives rest? For how long? And notice the unraveling of that cycle. And then notice when the people stop calling out to God altogether. And what happens after that point? Things get a lot worse. Okay, now let me talk about the background to the book of Ruth. So the events of Ruth are happening at the same time as the events of Judges, probably towards the later end of the events of Judges. Just like with Judges, we don't know exactly who authored this story. It's written, again, probably fairly close to when the events actually occurred, sometime during the reign of King David. Its genre is historiography as well. It's given in like a short story form, almost like a dramatic play, if you will. It was the reality TV of its time. This story, I can imagine, would have been one that they loved to hear when they gathered around the campfire at night. Hey, Dad, tell us a story. We want to hear the story of Ruth because it's daring and it's dangerous and there's intrigue and there's romance and suspense and drama, all the things that we love. And of course, God at work in the midst of all of it. And like I said, these events occurred during the time of Judges, towards the end of Judges. So when you read Judges and you see how bad things got, picture this story happening at the same time. So Ruth's structure, it's very short. There's just 4 chapters to this book. The first chapter is all about grief and loss. It's the story of Ruth, but also really it's the story of Naomi. She bookends the book of Ruth, and we see a description of all these women have to endure. Then the middle portion of Ruth is about putting them back together again after grief and loss have left them undone. So it's a story of kindness and provision and protection. And then the very end gives us God's perspective in the story, that he brings goodness out of even bad situations if we let him, if we stay attuned to God. So some themes in theology to look for, like Judges, we're going to see God's grace and mercy is abundant. Like Judges, we see that this is what God wants to do. He wants to show graciousness. He wants to give us mercy. He already loves us. He wants to do these things. But in order to receive, the people have to turn towards God. We're going to see in Judges that they don't. But here in Ruth, they do. And what a difference it makes. We'll see God's provision and protection, especially for the marginalized. God is very concerned for people who don't have the power to do things for themselves. Poorer people who have any kind of ailment or struggle because of suffering, people who have no family, people who are strangers, foreigners. God very much cares about widows and orphans. It is all through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. God is there for the marginalized, and this is a story of 2 women who are about as marginalized as you could have gotten in the ancient Near East, and the way that God provides for them. It's also a story of redemption, and it's a story of perspective. we're going to see that God plays the long game. And this is illustrated so beautifully. I love, love, love the book of Ruth. Could not love it more. I'm super excited for you guys to read this and to get to talk about it in more detail in a couple of lectures here. Some background info to help you understand what's going on. First of all, this is happening during harvest season. And at this time, men would leave their villages to work on the harvest. They would help one another, and they would spend the night, camp beside the piles of grain as they reaped and threshed them, so that no one could come in and steal their hard work. So they would work all day and then sleep by these piles of grain at night, often inviting prostitutes into their midst. Yes, I told you, it gets a little racy here. So know that background when you're reading this story. And then let's talk about what a kinsman redeemer is. I've already introduced this concept because we saw some laws about it in the Pentateuch. And when I talked about the cities of refuge, I think I talked about the Goel or the kinsman redeemer. Goel is the Hebrew word for kinsman redeemer. Their job was to avenge the murder of a family member. So they would go and find the perpetrator and bring that perpetrator before the authorities. But remember, if it was an accidental murder, something like manslaughter, then the person could flee to a city of refuge, and the Goel was not allowed to bring that person out of the city of refuge. But the Goel had other jobs as well. So not only did he avenge any wrongdoing against his family, he also was responsible for redeeming ancestral land or property in the event of a loved one's death. So in this time in Israel, property was considered an inheritance, something given to you by God. So you could not sell your property forever and ever. You could lease it if you came into financial difficulty, but there were provisions for it to be returned to you. The year of Jubilee is one of those times that you were supposed to return any leased land back to its original owner. The death of a loved one was another opportunity. So let's say you have a brother, the brother passes away and has land. You would then acquire that land by purchasing it or paying off the lease, whatever was necessary to take the land back into your family. So if it was mortgaged for financial needs, then the next of kin, this Goel, had to buy it back. And that meant that they had to pony up their own money to do so. Also, the Goel was responsible for marrying the widow of a family member who died, whose husband had died and left that woman no son. So if you were a widower without a son, you yourself had no means of survival, and your husband had no means of carrying on the family line. Like his family line would then pass away because he had no son to carry on. We kind of understand that concept in our modern day times because, for instance, if your family's traditional and the women take last names when they get married, and then you have no son and yours is the name could end. It could die out depending on whether or not you have sons to carry on the family name. Similar concept here. And so this person would marry. So again, let's use the circumstance of a brother. If your brother died and left a wife with no sons, then you had to marry her and take her into your family and then provide her with a child. So yes, sleep with her. And if she gave birth to a child, that child was accredited to your dead brother. So let's say you sleep with your sister-in-law, who's now your wife. She gives birth to a son. The son is technically your brother's son because you're redeeming his family line. So you can imagine that this already, you're seeing like there's all kinds of issues with this role, and that people were not always willing to fulfill all of the duties of being a Goel. You could forfeit your duties though. You had to be willing, but you could find another male relative to step up to the task. And the truth that we seem to understand from history is that a lot of times the Goel just wouldn't do everything that they were supposed to, especially the marriage piece. And we'll see this in the story of Ruth and talk more about it when we get to her lecture. So some things to notice as you're reading Ruth. The main characters are Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Notice how they change or they don't change in the story. Does their character develop over time, or are they consistent to who they were beginning to end? And what are their character traits? What are the main things that we notice about each of these people? Pay attention to Boaz. How does he respond to these women? Remember, these women are extremely marginalized, the least of the least in Hebrew society. So how does he treat them? Both Naomi and Ruth. Notice that the story ends with a genealogy, and pay attention to who is named in that genealogy and why it's important and why it ends that way. Like, why does this intriguing, dramatic love story end with a genealogy? It might seem weird until we pay attention to those names. And then notice where you find God in this story. So what you're going to see is God is not explicitly active. There's no parting of the Red Sea miracle. There's no burning bush. But that doesn't mean God is not at work. He is still active behind the scenes. So notice where you think that might be. All right, so happy reading and studying as you look at the book of Judges and Ruth, and we'll be back to talk about the book of Ruth. Judges. Judges first, then Ruth. All right, happy reading.